To discuss 5 steps for creating an engaged, collaborative culture, please welcome Kate Vitasek.
Good morning. All right, I'm going to have to pull a Dr. Yossi Sheffi. Give me some love. Good morning. Wow, we've had an amazing conference. I got to sit through all, since Sunday when we were here for the opening. We've talked about talent and technology and how AI is going to change the world, transformation, all these exciting times for supply chain practitioners. And this is what I'm going to share with you today are 5 simple steps that can help you lean in to your talented employees, to lean into your strategic partners that are going to help you bring engagement, collaboration, and a culture that's going to yield transformation. So I'm a researcher, an academic at the University of Tennessee, and one of the things I can unequivocally tell you from my research over the last 20 years is that the best results come when people flip their mindset. They change it from a what's in it for me mindset to a what's in it for we mindset. The best results come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group. That's a true win-win. So why do we turn around and fall short? And I would argue it is because we're trained to be me. When you all stood up, right, what did you look like? You looked like a little I, not a T. You weren't using the power of T, you were using an I. You were selfish, right? And so naturally, I want to optimize for me, but the best results come when we optimize for both and we share, right? So we grow the pie, share the pie. So I just picked on some negotiation books. This is one, Start with No, right? And I hope no one in here starts with no when you're working on a strategic relationship. This is what I call the value extraction approach. I want to take money out of your pocket and put it into mine. Cost savings, look at the bid structures that we do. It's all about comparing apples to apples to apples and who can give me the best price. And I like to think about this as having an orange, right? So in Fisher and Uri's book, Getting to Yes, they talk about the orange. And here, we're just fighting over the orange, right? And I put, the buyer over here, the supplier over here, and we're playing tug of war. We're using our power to help us, and we're extracting value instead of creating value. Now, a step up from that is Fisher and Uri's amazing best-selling book. I mean, I read this in 1993 when I was in college, Getting to Yes. Many of y'all probably read this as well. And I think it's really good, but it's incomplete. It's kind of what Nash said, it's incomplete. Because you negotiate an agreement without giving in, and this is really great. So take that orange, which Fisher and Uri talk about, and a win-win is when you get the pulp and I get the peel. But here's where this falls short. We still only have one orange. We exchanged value in a very good way, but we didn't create value. So while we took that tension out of our relationship, by the way, that tension in economic terms is called transaction cost economics. There's a cost to the tension in our relationships of rework, and the lack of trust that we have actually costs us money. So I would submit, not only because the research says it, but because real companies who choose to create value are getting to we. They're leaning into these partnerships, not just saying a strategic partnership or a valued employee, but they're co-creating and creating value. And when I do that, think about this. I put the power of my employee and the power of the employer on the same side of the rope. So here we're pulling together and we put our objectives, our goals, the value we want to create. And so it exponentially lets us use our power, and that lets us plant an orange tree. Instead of still having one orange, now we're planting over the long term. Let's look at how we invest to get a return on investment. And I get really sad when I look at this industry sometimes, especially with regards to our labor, our most trusted employees. And we had the West Coast port strikes, and now they're back. And then we had the UPS Teamsters, and now we have the United Auto Workers. So we say our employees are the most valuable, and then we sit across the table trying to negotiate and extract value. And that's an obvious place where we see misalignment in the news. But most of you, I would argue, have misalignment every day in your organizations. Think about your buyer-supplier relationships and how you negotiate with them. I sat through Dr. Langley's amazing study. I've been tracking it for years. And it says, gosh, we need to have these more longer-term relationships, right? Someone's got to invest in all this great technology. And I turn around and I study contracts, and that isn't what's happening. Your contracts say, I've got a 60-day termination for convenience. I know you're a strategic supplier, you're amazing, and here I've negotiated a termination for convenience. We need you to invest, but it's all about price for the transaction. How much is your per pallet, per shipment, your per unit, your per mile? And as Dr. Langley pointed out, we aren't enabling the suppliers enough profit to make the investments in some of these amazing technologies that you want and so need. But it's functional silo to functional silo. Operations says, let's go and do these amazing things. And then I have procurement that turns around and says, well, I know you've got this trusted supplier, but our policy says every 2 years we have to bid them out. We don't trust them. We have to test the market, right? Or the contract, the lawyers, the actual clauses don't add up. So I think of the buyers as having a three-headed monster: procurement, operations, and legal. They're not aligned. Do you ever feel that? Like within your own company, you have a three-headed monster? And of course, we have bosses and employees. So misalignment is rampant in organizations, and that's costing you money because you're not getting to we. You're not working together as much to optimize. So we know optimization. This industry is famous for it, right? Some of the awards. We know we need to optimize. Let's slow down and use 5 simple steps that can help us truly co-create. Put your buyer and your supplier together and the value you want to create over there. I think of that as being your Mount Everest. Your Mount Everest. What's your Mount Everest? So here's the steps. And I'm going to walk through each step through the lens of a case study. Now, I'm excited because we have tons of case studies, which I'm going to give you a QR code. So you can go and read more about amazing things that BP's doing, Intel's doing, the Square Kilometer Array, who is the treaty for the world's next generation telescope, and how they're choosing to slow down and strategically really embed a culture of co-creation into the relationships. So this particular case study, it is available. We have lots more case studies. So we're going to look at each of the steps that Island Health took. Now let me give you the backstory. Island Health, a little tiny health authority on the west coast of Canada. Government is, government owns healthcare in Canada. So government, buyer, healthcare, highly regulated. They're doctors, a union doctor. So it's not, UPS and the Teamsters, it's the Canadian government and their doctors. One of their most precious assets in healthcare is your doctors. But look at the news. They had the same problem that we have here with some of our labor disputes. Strategies to intimidate, 1 year later, no sign of a deal, doctor suspended. It was this bitter back and forth tit for tat with our most precious employees, our doctors. The doctors weren't happy, the health authority, the administrators weren't happy. And so they came to us and said, we're going back and forth in these negotiations and it's simply not working. We need to get to we. So one of the first things we did was to take a pulse of the culture. And look what it said. Distrustful, strained, broken, dysfunctional, adversarial, toxic, opaque, untrusting. Is that a culture that you want to be in? Are you going to perform your best? Is the administrators going to be like, oh, now I have to go meet with the doctors? It's a headache for everyone. No one likes this environment. And so when you start to put that culture in front of people, how does that make you feel? Not very good. So the culture created these adversarial relationships, and the culture can undo and create an amazing relationship. So step one of the getting to we process is to talk openly and candidly about trust or the lack of trust. What's causing this lack of trust? Transparency, right? Island Health said opaque. We don't know what you do. We don't trust you. So what do we do when we don't trust? We have to micromanage you. Stephen Covey's book, right, The Speed of Trust, talks about 7 taxes of trust. Not having trust costs lots and lots of money. And then cultural fit, right? As I say, in a buyer-supplier world, maybe not with employees, but in a buyer-supplier world, cultural fit matters. A drug dealer shouldn't marry a Southern Baptist. It's just not gonna work. But you know what? Drug dealers can marry drug dealers and Southern Baptists can marry, it'll work pleasantly. And cultural fit doesn't mean you look like me. Think about how we make decisions in companies, top down or bottom up. That's cultural fit. It's not that you look like me. We want diversity, but we need to make decisions. We need to have the same philosophy with transparency. If I'm transparent and you're not, I don't trust you. So put that elephant in the room, and that's exactly what Island Health did. So I talked about Covey's work, right? So above all, success in business requires 2 things: a winning competitive strategy, a superb organizational execution. No one would debate that. But distrust is the enemy of both. And Covey says, I submit that while high trust won't necessarily rescue a poor strategy, low trust will almost always derail them. And you think about your most strategic suppliers. Do a pulse on the trust. And maybe what's causing us to not be successful is not having as much trust as we should. So should we put that trust elephant in the room just like Island Health did? So they came together over a 3-day offsite. Now remember, they're in lawsuits, they hate each other, tough negotiations. The doctors can't walk out because they're government employees. Really not a great situation, much like what we're hearing today in the news. And so they took a pulse of their culture and said, this is where we're at today. And so they took about 20 people from each organization. Let's bring in 20 of the leaders, not just the union leaders, but actual doctors who do work. They took a mix of the employees, and they took a mix of the hospitalists, from the CEO down to someone who interfaced with them, and said, let's bring 40 people together and talk about trust. Talk about transparency. And so at the end of the first morning of that 3-day offsite, we challenged them. Do you want to stay in this culture, or would you like a better culture? And of course, they all said, this is not very good. This is stressful. We don't like it. It costs money. And we said, I want you to just pretend you had a perfect trusting culture, what would that look like? And everybody got 3 words. They got on stickies. So they came up with their 3 words, and they wrote them down, and we created a wordle. We said, this is where you want to be. So if here I am today, here I am in the future. Now, what prevents me from having this amazing culture? It's behaviors, how we act. So when you do something in that negotiation, or you don't do something, I react, and I react negatively if I don't trust you. So we said, during this meeting, just pretend that you have this culture. So every day we're going to come into this room and we're gonna be respectful.
The graphs with the words of how we felt, and when you looked at the one at the beginning of the 3 days and how profoundly negative it was, to the one at the end of 3 days, and you know, there was all this hope.
Wow, there's all this hope, right? We got here by the way we act, and we can get here by the way we act. So it gave them hope that maybe, just maybe, they can get to a contract instead of being in lawsuits. So step 2 is to co-create your shared vision and objectives. Notice I use the word specifically co-create, because it's not about the buyer or the boss saying, here's our vision, here's your objectives. You have to get the buy-in. So they stepped back, the administrators stepped back and said, doctors, you are the best at what you do. Help us create a vision for what we could do. What's the art of the possible look like? I call this your Mount Everest. What's your Mount Everest? And you co-create it. So with those 40 people, they began to envision what utopia would look like. What was their Mount Everest? I also think of this as the moon. What's your moon shot? Kennedy used this trick. We're gonna put a man on the moon in 10 years or less. People rallied around it. So if I don't have something to rally around, what do? I show up to work. I just show up and I do my work. But now I can show up to work with a purpose to create value. So what does that value look like? What's your Mount Everest? What's your moonshot? So for Island Health and the hospitalist, this is their shared vision. And it wouldn't matter what words are on the screen, it was their shared vision. Everyone walked out and they had their fingerprint on it. They had buy-in. Every word mattered. And Kim Crone said, you know, one of the major game changers was that creation of a shared vision. It wasn't the Island Health Authority and the administrators saying, dear union, or dear supplier, this is what we want from you. They said, I'm gonna respect the doctors. Or I could change this to Dell and Genco when they flipped their reverse logistics, BP and Jones Lang LaSalle. I have over 100 examples where when you come together and you co-create, it creates the buy-in to create value. So it's not about the transaction and doing the work. You need to show up and do those transactions, but now I'm doing a transaction with a purpose for something bigger than either one of us. So step 1, talk about trust, transparency, and cultural fit. Step 2, choose to create something bigger than either one of you. So in this step, we address what I call guiding principles. Now, guiding principles are social norms. We don't make them up, they're there. Actually, a definition of social norms, I pulled this from the dictionary, the informal rules that govern the behaviors in group or societies. And what Island Health had happen in the relationship, just like you see UPS and the Teamsters, just like you see buyer-supplier relationships or even boss-employee relationships, they created a social norm that wasn't respectful, that was opaque, that wasn't trusting. So they allowed behaviors to creep in that created a negative environment, and that negative environment We know from research, Stephen Covey, all the economic work that is done, transaction cost economics, negativity in the relationships, this friction cost money.